Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
Today, we're going to be revisiting a topic that we discussed in great detail during Season 1. You might recall our 3-episode series on waterfowl harvest estimation in North America. That was the series of episodes where we had Dr. Kathy Fleming and Dr. Paul Padding join us. Today, we're going to be providing a bit of an update on a few things related to that harvest estimation process. And specifically, it's going to be an update with respect to the Harvest Information Program, HIP, certification that most hunters, all waterfowl hunters, should be aware of. So this is going to be an episode that waterfowl hunters will want to listen to. We'll give you some updates, give you some information on these updates and what's happening in that realm. To help us with this conversation, I'm going to welcome in Brad Bortner, recently retired from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Larry Reynolds, Waterfowl Study Leader for Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. Brad and Larry, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much, Mike.
Happy to be with you, Mike.
Brad, I want to start with you. I've introduced you as retired from the Fish and Wildlife Service, most recently as the chief of the Migratory Division of Migratory Bird Management. But I want to give you an opportunity to tell our listeners a bit more about what you've done throughout your career.
I grew up on the shores of the Chesapeake Bay, and as a high school student, I decided I wanted to be a waterfowl biologist. I had the opportunity to work with Larry Hindman, a waterfowl biologist for the state of Maryland. As a high school student, he introduced me to banding waterfowl, and I went off to the University of Vermont and got myself a degree in wildlife biology, and also a degree in forestry along the way. And after my first senior year, I was told about a unique opportunity at the Delta Waterfowl Research Station. So I went off and spent the summer at Delta Waterfowl Research Station, where I was introduced to all sorts of students and professors working on waterfowl on all sorts of different topics, and became fascinated with it. And got really interested in the idea of working on bioenergetics. So I went to Johns Hopkins University to work with a professor who was working with tundra swans. Tundra swans at that point in time were a poorly studied species. And I spent a year at Johns Hopkins and then transferred to the University of Maryland, where I did a master's degree in the bioenergetics of tundra swans at Mattamuskeet National Wildlife Refuge in North Carolina. And after I finished that degree, I was off to Iowa State to start a PhD on snow geese, but got offered a permanent full-time job with the federal government. And I decided, well, I would take that track in my career. And I started with the Fish and Wildlife Service. I worked a few years as a woodcock specialist for Fish and Wildlife Service at Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. And then worked as a waterfowl biologist for them, conducting surveys and analyses of populations and banding waterfowl. And after a few years of that, I became the chief of the section of population assessment, which is the group at Patuxent that takes all of the status information about waterfowl and migratory bird populations and develops the science behind appropriate hunting regulations and analyzes the effect of certain hunting regulations. And then in 1992, I decided I would like to get away from Maryland for a while. So I transferred to Portland, Oregon, where I became the regional chief of migratory birds. And I worked from 1992 to 2011 in Portland and covered all of the migratory bird issues in California, Oregon, Idaho, Nevada, and the Pacific Islands. Along the way, got very involved in quite a number of the joint ventures throughout the region, and worked on habitat issues with all of our partners. And then in 2011, it was my turn to stand up and take a leadership role as the chief of the Division of Migratory Bird Management in Washington, D.C., in our headquarters office. And you covered most of the responsibilities of that here recently with your interview with Ken Richkes. But, basically that position covers the whole breadth of the migratory bird program in our headquarters office, sets policy and budget, and it works with international and national partners. And so included trips to Russia, Japan, Mexico, and Canada to meet with our treaty partners, and many trips to Capitol Hill, and even one to the White House to talk about migratory bird issues.
Thank you for that introduction, Brad. So it's no stretch to say that throughout your career, you have worked on pretty much every aspect of migratory bird management. And so you are a natural person to be working on the topic that we're going to be talking about. And we're delighted to have you and your expertise joining us here on the podcast. So thank you for that. And thank you for all the work that you've done over the years to help with this resource. Certainly, I know I echo that on behalf of all of Ducks Unlimited. But anyway, I'd just like to take the opportunity to say thank you for all that work that you've done. Larry, I want to go to you now and offer you the same opportunity to introduce yourself to our listeners. The frequent listeners of the podcast will recognize your name, will recognize your voice. You've been on with us a few times already, but nevertheless, for those that may be tuning in for the first time, tell us a little bit about yourself and your career.
Well, I came to the obsession with waterfowl ecology and hunting a little bit later than Brad did. I thought I was going to make a living playing baseball, but after 2 years of college eligibility, it became obvious that I was not. And at that time, the only thing I really cared about was ducks and duck hunting. I was raised in Sacramento, California, in the middle of the Central Valley. I did my bachelor's work at University of California at Davis, working with a pretty renowned waterfowl biologist and professor, Dr. Dennis Raveling. And then in 1986, I moved to College Station, Texas, where I did my master's work in wildlife biology with another icon of the waterfowl industry, Dr. Milton Weller, developing waterfowl habitat from coal mine reclamation. And then in 1989, I moved here to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, to pursue a PhD in wildlife and another master's in applied statistics. I did some work on the population ecology of lesser scaup, analyzing all of the banding and harvest data. I ended up not finishing those degrees, but getting an awful lot of really terrific work experience, especially while working for the Waterways Experiment Station of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Vicksburg, Mississippi. I participated in waterfowl-related projects in North Dakota, South Dakota, Indiana, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and of course in Mississippi. And at the point that I decided to stop doing that work, I did some diving duck research for the National Wetlands Research Center in Lafayette, Louisiana, before I embarked on my serious career. You know, all of us wake up one day and say, "Wow, we've done a lot of cool things in a lot of cool places, but maybe I better find 20 years to work if I'm going to entertain the idea of retirement." And so I went to work doing coastal wetland restoration with the Department of Natural Resources in Louisiana. I did that for 6 years before I was given the opportunity to come back to waterfowl work full time. I moved to the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries as the North American Waterfowl Management Plan Coordinator in 2005. And then in 2008, I took over as the Waterfowl Program Manager. And I've been in that position since then. I have a feeling that's where I'm going to end my career.
It's a delight to have you back on the show as well. You and I have of course worked together for, well, close to 20 years now, getting close to that anyway. And so it's a treat to be able to keep in touch with you on a lot of these topics and appreciate your time. And so we have a really neat lineup here with the two of you joining us because, of course, Brad, your experience, your career in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on the federal side, and then, of course, Larry, yours with the state side. That partnership, as we're going to talk about as we go through this, between the federal government and the state governments in this harvest estimation process, and the particular topic with respect to HIP certification that we're all going to be focusing on today is absolutely critical. And I know people are probably going to get sick and tired of us talking about that collaboration as we go through this, but it's impossible to overemphasize that. We can't stress it enough how important that partnership is between the states and the feds when managing this resource, which does not recognize state boundaries, transcends state boundaries, transcends national boundaries. And so a perfect combination of people to join us and help us with this conversation. And so to get right into this, I want to reference the previous podcasts, the previous episodes related to harvest estimation. Those were episodes 60, 61, and 62 from season 1. If you haven't listened to those and you want to learn more about the details of this process, I certainly encourage you to go back and listen to those. We're not going to step through all of those aspects of it on this. We're only going to be pulling out the Harvest Information Program process to talk about it in detail and some certain changes that are going or that are being explored. Let's just say it like that. So to start out with, Brad, I want to go to you. And I do think it's important to provide our listeners a review of the Harvest Information Program and what it is and what hunters' role is in it. So can you give us just a quick overview of the Harvest Information Program?
The Harvest Information Program is the beginning steps of how the Fish and Wildlife Service and the states estimate the number of migratory birds, game birds that are harvested during the hunting seasons. And this all came about in the early 90s when it was realized that we're having difficulty estimating the number of waterfowl hunters anymore because the system that they had used since the 60s had kind of broken down. And those of us who were working on the non-waterfowl migratory game birds, had no sampling frame for estimating the harvest of those other non-waterfowl species. So between the states and the Fish and Wildlife Service, they got together and started talking about ways to solve this problem. And they came up with a system called the Harvest Information Program. And since migratory bird regulations are under the purview of the federal government by way of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which prohibits all take unless authorized by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the licensing aspects, which were under the purview of the states, they developed a cooperative program called HIP, in which the states collect the name and addresses and the response to some harvest questions from the hunters, and then turn that information over to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And the Fish and Wildlife Service uses those names and addresses and responses to those questions as the sampling frame for doing migratory game bird harvest estimation nationwide. And the important part of this is that the hunter's role is giving the name and addresses and answering those questions, which help the Fish and Wildlife Service conduct an effective and efficient survey.
And those questions that you referenced there, they're the ones where if you are at if you're buying your hunting license, whether it be online or whether it be at a point of sale with a retailer, they're the questions where they ask you, well, you guys may have to tell me on the exact language of this because I always get it mixed up. But they ask you the first question is whether you intend to hunt migratory birds this year. Do I have that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And so then if you say yes, then it goes through a series of questions that ask you about your harvest success in different groups of migratory birds the previous year, right?
Yes, that's an idea to find out how successful you are. The old adage, and I think Paul Padding referenced in one of your episodes, 60 or 61, the old adage that 20% of the hunters harvest 80% of the ducks. Well, in my mind, it might even be closer to 10% of the hunters harvest 90% of the ducks. And it's finding an efficient way to sample those people, all the hunters, of, you know, in an efficient manner, so they can, and those questions help put people into different groups.
Different groups that are then sampled for completing the 2 surveys. So like there's 3 components of this overall harvest estimation process. Maybe from a course view, you have the harvest information program, which provides those names and addresses we're talking about. And then you're selected from those, from that list to complete a couple of surveys, one or both of the surveys, that being the wing survey and the hunter diary surveys. And the mechanics of those surveys and what they are and what those data, how those data are used, were described in detail by Kathy and Paul in those previous episodes. So again, if you want to go back and listen to those specifics, I encourage you to do so. But just want to be clear that the questions that are being asked at that point of sale, whether online or at a vendor, about the number of birds you harvested the previous year, those are not used to estimate the harvest. Those are not the harvest estimates that you're providing. Larry, I want to ask you a question about that. Do you find there's a bit of misunderstanding about that? And some people maybe think that when they're answering those questions, they're actually doing so. Those numbers are used to estimate harvest. Do you find some confusion in that regard?
Constant and overwhelming sometimes, Mike. There's a view communicated to me by many of our hunters about those HIP registration questions and why the harvest data is absolutely meaningless, because many, if not most, of the retail license vendors don't ask the question, or hunters, you know, they're asked that question right off the cuff, and so they don't have exact harvest estimates. And I have explained over the 20 years of my career in Louisiana that those HIP registration questions are not the harvest data. And if you would stop and think, they can't possibly be, because the harvest estimates used to be published on July 15th. Now they're published a little bit later because of the changes in our hunting regulation process. But most of our hunters don't even buy their hunting licenses until late July, August, or September. So how could those questions possibly be the harvest data when the harvest data were published before most of you bought your hunting licenses? That's when their eyes open wide and they actually begin to think a little bit. But it is one of the confusing aspects of HIP, is that this is the first step, as Brad explained, in estimating the harvest. And here you are asking people about what they harvested the prior year. What's the points that I make with my hunters in the communication that I do is that more important than the questions about how many doves did you kill last year, how many ducks did you kill last year, is the fact that you hunted doves, or you hunted ducks, or you hunted woodcock. Because as Brad explained earlier, we need a sampling frame to estimate the harvest of all of those species. But if we don't know how many, for example, Louisiana has 184,000 HIP registered hunters last year. So 184,000 people expressed an intent to hunt migratory birds. Well, if I don't know how many of them hunted woodcock or how many of them hunted doves, then my survey can be very inefficient if those HIP registration questions are not asked and answered, so that we can segregate those hunters into duck hunters, woodcock hunters, dove hunters. And when we talk about it, when I get a chance to talk about it at public meetings, hunters come around pretty quickly.
Now, when you say they come around pretty quickly, does that mean they understand, they begin to understand exactly how the harvest information program works? Is that what you're saying?
They understand what our goal is in asking those HIP registration questions. I don't know Mike, there always has been and there always will be distrust of government. And I think I'm safe to say that throughout my career, that has increased. And for the most part, it is very unreasonable. And so just because hunters come around to understanding what it is, what information you're trying to get, and why you're trying to get it, oftentimes it doesn't make them any more cooperative, especially in some groups of hunters where they just don't think anyone has a right to know what they harvest and when.
Be the first to know when ducks are on the move. Sign up for DU's waterfowl migration email alerts and receive ongoing in-depth updates on the latest habitat conditions, weather changes, and hunting reports for your flyway. Visit ducks.org/migration alerts.
Perhaps there is some greater understanding that can be achieved as if we're able to more effectively communicate or to share exactly why these data are so important and why the hunter's participation at very high levels is so important. So let's talk about that. Why are these data important? Larry, from your perspective, as a state waterfowl biologist, you interact with other state waterfowl biologists through the flyway system. So just talk about the importance of these harvest data from your perspective.
Well, first and foremost, Mike, harvest data are required to maintain open hunting seasons. I mean, as Brad hinted at earlier, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act closes all hunting seasons unless we provide the biological justification for opening them. And without harvest data, we're shooting in the dark. Literally. And that provides one thing that every hunter is starkly aware of is that there are people, large numbers of people in this country that don't necessarily agree with hunting wild animals. And they are always on the lookout for opportunities through legal and other means to stop or curtail our hunting opportunity. And back in the early 90s, when Brad described the breakdown of the sampling frame, that activity was going on the basis of poor harvest estimates. We may be able to curtail or close hunting seasons due to inadequate harvest data. And so first and foremost, those data are critically important for us to maintain open hunting seasons.
And so, Brad, now I want to get your perspective. What other uses are there for these harvest data? Larry, I will say that your answer there was in lockstep with one of the examples that Paul gave us on one of those earlier episodes where he talked about that very thing, where there were some groups that were kind of starting to put some pressure on. They began to think about, well, what justification do we have for some of these hunting seasons for some of these species? And so that was at that time, as you described, a key impetus for kind of moving in this direction. And it's always going to be there. And so that it's, as you say, incredibly important for these to have these data for that purpose. Brad, what other ways are these data used?
Well, before I get into that, I'll just reiterate what Larry's point and your point there. Having been in the position of having to answer that question or answer those questions in some of those jobs that I laid out for you, it's very uncomfortable if I had not had at least harvest information to sit there and say, yes, we are monitoring the number of hunters and the number of birds that are harvested from those populations. So that is a very vital role for this information. But it's also very important information. It feeds into the development of harvest strategies. And currently, there are a number of species of game birds that the Fish and Wildlife Service and the states through the Flyway Councils have developed cooperative harvest strategies. And the whole idea there is that we would agree to the rules of the game, or what the hunting regulations should be based upon those outside metrics before we get there. And so instead of having an annual debate on what the hunting regulations are, we've had the debate. We've said when harvest is at this level or that level, we will take action to either liberalize or restrict. So there's a very direct value to hunters by providing precise and accurate harvest information. Also, as I like to point out to people, that there are uses of that information for allocation of money for habitat acquisition programs, habitat management programs. There are also that the harvest information is available and displayed on websites where hunters can do a little internet scouting of their own and look at the harvest in their county, in their state, compare it to all the other counties in that state, or compare states to states or counties to counties across the whole country. There are also information available on the websites that we can provide links to that look at the seasonality of harvest. Say you're planning a trip to go hunting in Louisiana and you want to know the best times of the year, you can pull up the information and look and see when their peaks of harvest are in Louisiana and in adjacent states. So there's a number of roles or uses of this information, and that we wanted to let the hunters know how important their participation is and how they benefit from providing the information to the state and Fish and Wildlife Service.
Brad, is there you might have mentioned this and I just blanked on it. Did you mention a website where you can find that data? I don't think I was aware of that particular application.
Yes. One of Kathy's websites lets you explore harvest data, and that's available at fws.gov/harvest survey /harvest-viz. And you can look at, average harvest numbers for any state in the country. You can look at seasonality, and then you can look, burrow all the way down to a county level. And it's a great tool. When you have a chance to look at it and your listeners have a chance to look at it, I'll bet people spend a lot of time taking a deep dive into what are the patterns of harvest across the country, how their county compares to their home county, or some place where they have visited, and they can get in an argument with their hunting partners on what's the highest harvest county in the state. So I think it's a very useful tool for hunters and they can understand how they're providing the information that allow this to happen.
Absolutely. That's a great resource. I'll have to look into that. And I want to drive home sort of a point here. Kathy and Paul mentioned this, but the value of that application that you just described, where you can view harvest estimates across different states and different times, and even down to the different counties, the reliability of those data depend on the participation of the hunters, depend on the participation of the hunters in the Harvest Information Program certification, HIP certification that we're talking about, answering the questions correctly, as accurately as they can based on their memory, but then also their willing and accurate participation in the surveys that they might receive as a result of being sampled from that HIP framework, and those being the wing surveys and the hunter diary survey. So hunters have an absolutely vital role. Without hunters, we can't get the data. It's that simple. And if we don't get quality data, then the inferences that we as managers can draw from that data, or hunters could draw from that data based on the application you just described, well, its quality is suspect. So again, it's one of those things where hunters themselves determine the value of the data. So Larry, I want to go to you now with the next question, and let's just talk about, have you give our listeners an understanding of the state's role in the harvest information process. We've talked generally about it, but I want you to explain specifically what the state's role is in this, and is it similar across all the states?
Well, the end product is similar for all states, and that is that we need to provide the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service a list of hunters' names, addresses, and information about their prior migratory bird hunting activity and their success. That's the foundation from which the Fish and Wildlife Service is going to draw a sample of hunters to participate in what you call the diary survey, and then the parts collection or the wing survey. And that's the state's responsibility in this partnership. Each state has a responsibility to protect the privacy of their hunters' information. And that's one of the reasons that there's a state and federal partnership in this effort. And so the end product is the same for all states, but how we get there can be quite a bit different. Some states like Missouri lump HIP registration with a migratory bird hunting license. Every hunter that wants to hunt migratory birds of any species in the state of Missouri has to buy a migratory bird hunting license, and that includes the HIP registration questions. They currently charge $6 for that license, which accomplishes a couple of things. Just like in Louisiana, we have a resident duck license that costs $5.50 for every resident that wants to hunt ducks in the state. And then we charge nothing for HIP. HIP is free. But when you charge for something like a migratory bird hunting license that has HIP attached to it, people that don't intend to hunt migratory birds are not going to buy it. You know, even if it's a couple bucks, anybody that isn't going to hunt migratory birds isn't going to spend money for a HIP registration. That's one of the issues in states like Texas and Louisiana that don't charge for the HIP registration. We often get a number of hunters that don't intend to hunt migratory birds registering with HIP. And as Brad mentioned earlier, that makes it a little more difficult to estimate the number of hunters that you have in your state. Some states do HIP registration completely online. In Louisiana, until this year, you could get a HIP registration wherever you purchased your hunting license, either online or at retail license vendors. And so there's a variety of ways that the states do HIP registration to certify their hunters to legally hunt migratory birds while collecting that information, names, addresses, and which species of migratory birds and how successful those hunters were in prior years. The states put that together in a different way. And if we haven't said it already, it's important for everyone to know that hunters are required to register with HIP in every state that they hunt. You know, you take a real worldly guy like Brad Bortner that may hunt in 4 or 5 or 6 different states, and he has to register with HIP separately in every state that he hunts. And in some states, it's done a little bit different.
Thank you for that, Larry. One thing worth clarifying here is that when we say hunters are required to get the HIP certification in all the states where they hunt, we're talking only about migratory bird hunters. They're the ones with that responsibility. That's understood among the three of us, and hopefully it's understood among all of our listeners at this time, but just wanted to emphasize that. And if you are one of those migratory bird hunters, we thank you for your participation in HIP through the years. We thank you for your participation in any of the other harvest estimation surveys, and we encourage your continued participation in those surveys. With all that said, this is probably a good place to wrap up this episode. We have a lot more to bring you on this topic, and that's going to be the focus of episode 2. And that's going to even include some discussions about some changes that are afoot with regard to the Harvest Information Program certification in some states. And that's important information. We want you to hear about that. So we're going to have Brad and Larry rejoin us for that particular episode. With that said, I'm going to extend a special thanks to our guest on today's show, Brad Bortner, retired from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Larry Reynolds, Waterfowl Study Leader for Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. We certainly appreciate their time and expertise. Additionally, and always, we thank our producer, Clay Baird, for the great and tireless work that he does editing these podcasts and getting them out to you. And of course, you, the listeners, we thank you for your time. We thank you for your interest in these episodes, and we thank you for your support, passion, and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.